Welcome to Dr. Deep State. Today we have our friend Will Tucker with us. And Will is going to do more or less a continuation of what he did last time. It's very esoteric, a bit deep, so I'm going to kind of try to guide all of us into what Will's conversation is going to be. I think if we want to have a rough way of saying it, it's preparing the world for the Mashiach. I think what we're eventually moving toward is preparing the world for big Israel. It's a project going on. Preparing the world for the Heavenly Jerusalem project, which appears to be planned for the region we call the Ukraine. But we'll get there eventually. Before I introduce Will, let me talk for a moment about how I got into this topic. It was about 20 years ago. It was post 9/11 time, and I was a grad student working on my dissertation, and I ended up incorporating some of these ideas. I was kind of fascinated by the idea of who the neocons were, the idea of the neocons preparing the world for X. I didn't know what was going on. So I was already deeply involved in this idea, the seeds of the rise of American empire and I was hooking together what looked to be the 21st century neocon project with the seeds of that in terms of geostrategic policy. And so I really wanted to get into the roots of that doctrine, the roots of where neoconism came from. And I'm still doing it. I'm still at it. But what I found, one of the talking points that one would often go toward is Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, mid-20th century. Some of that would take you back to Carl Schmitt, this idea of the state of exception or the perpetual state of exception we now find ourselves in. So these were many of the ideas I've been working in for 20 years. Throughout the 2004, 5, 6, all the way into 2010 and 11, I just couldn't get my head around it. I put the mechanics of it into my dissertation, but sort of grace shined a light on me, and I took it into this mystical spot, this esoteric piece, the esoteric agenda of the neocons. And all through my writing, when I was conferencing these kind of papers about who the neocons are, what their objectives were, not very popular at conferences. I always wondered why I was the only person pursuing this. I thought it was really the issue of our day. But what I came to find was that inside of the project, from the very nut of the beginning of the rise of American empire, its geostrategic naval policy that came up with the turn of the 19th century, it was pitted around this. I have my students right now reading 1984 and this idea of doublethink. But it was this, not quite the idea that war is peace, but offense was defense. And that got embedded at that point. And we still hear that, in the minds of, well, both the readers of 1984, and Will might even touch on that, the land people and the sea people and the perpetual dialectic. But this idea that war is peace. It's so ingrained in us over the last 10, 20, 50 years. So what I really have been interested in, and I became interested in the neocons' desire to have a certain amount of control over the economics, the political, and the social. But ultimately, I got interested in the biopolitics embedded in in the intellectual roots of their agenda. And ultimately, I called it the esoteric biopolitics of this new order that they were creating, because it was ultimately about an order not just of the politics and the economics, but mind, body, and spirit. So it had an esoteric agenda, something it was moving toward. So we could call this the neocons preparing us for the Antichrist. Will and I are probably not going to use that because it sounds kind of cheesy. But at the end of the day, what we're really asking is, who are the neocons? Will is going to continue talking to us about Rebbe Schneerson because, again, I work in social science and I like probabilistic thinking. And I once did a video, let's put it out there in terms of variables and think is this the head of the snake? Do you want 40%, 60%? One thing we know about this group that's they're definitely a means to an end group. They'll take any kind of activity to get where they're going. So give them a lot of power in terms of where they're moving the direction of the world. So I wanted, before I got into these heavy ideas of will, just to kind of put it in some kind of practical geostrategic or political terms that we might connect or relate to. But when we think of Schneerson and we think of the neocons, people like to take us back, or Wikipedia would take us back to Leo Strauss, but they will not mention the Rebbe, because I really think this is the tip of the sword of the direct the future, and it will include the biopolitics, I think, of the big Israel, which is a name the current leader of Ukraine called he sees as the future of Ukraine. So I talked for quite a bit there, Will. I hope you liked my introduction, and that somehow weaved into what you're about to do. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that was great, Doug. Thank you very much. I think that sets the stage well. Again, what I'm going to present here, I'm mostly going to be reading, so please, as before, interrupt me, ask questions if something doesn't make sense. This is pretty dense material and something I'm trying to wrap my mind around, and so if it may not come out very clearly, so please stop me and ask me questions as I go. So, all right, you ready for me to jump into it?
I sure am.
All right, great. So, building on our theme of the dialectic between Zionism and communism that steers nationalist and globalist efforts toward the same messianic goal, we introduce the concept of Jewish antinomianism as a common denominator. The dialectical strategy of contradiction is applied to the common ground of the Mosaic Law as a way to generate political will and etheric energy. The following presentation will follow on the 20th century Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was anointed as the seventh and final Rebbe of the extremely powerful and influential sect of Hasidic Judaism known as Chabad Lubavitch. The Rebbe, who passed away in 1994, was very explicit about his earthly mission to bring about the unveiling of the Jewish Messiah, known as the Moshiach, and transforming reality to receive his coming. Among his followers, Schneerson was widely believed to be the actual Messiah, awaiting his reception on the global stage. As stated before, this research has been drawn from the writing of the scholar Elliot Wolfson, who has posited the notion of a post-messianic messianism to explain the continuation of Schneerson's project in the wake of his absence. Before I unravel this concept of post-messianism, it'll be necessary to first examine the influence of the Neoplatonic tradition emerging from late antiquity on the divergent thought of post-temple Judaism and the early church fathers. Following from Philo to Plotinus into the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius and St. Augustine, the Greek philosophical tradition of the Logos and the great chain of being were incorporated into the framework of early Christian soteriology. The three primary Neoplatonic themes that inform the metaphysical synthesis of the New Covenant were the theory of emanation, the unio mystica, and apophatic or negative theology. The theory of emanation is an idea derived within Platonic thought from the problem of the one and the many, a debate that stems from questions surrounding the process of creation and the order of reality. According to Plato, God is identified as the one that creates and organizes reality into transcendent unity. The many are the complex and multifarious differences that flow from the one into the perfection of the imperfection of the temporal world. The problem arises from how the plurality of the many are unified into the order of the one. The Platonic theory of the forms was posed as a solution where eternal archetypes that emanate from the one mediate between the multiplicity of the many. Where there is a chair in the world, the perfected archetype of a chair exists in the realm of forms, mediating its chairness back to the transcendent reality of the one by a process known as hypostasis. This series of hypostatic mediations came to be known by the Neoplatonists as the great chain of being that emanates reality from its sublime source. Doing okay, Doug?
Yeah, Will and I talk about this sometimes. In the classical Greek and Orthodox, I'll say classic Christian traditions, we also have a term, and Vogelin uses it occasionally, the great chain of being. So I believe what Will might be talking about is not having us conflate these two things, or if we connect it to the church, that it's not a pagan idea. He's talking about two different ideas, maybe one parasites off the other, maybe one is a counterfeit of the other, but there is in classical theology a notion of the great chain of being. So he's talking about like a parallel version, right?
Exactly. Thanks, Doug. The similar concept of the unio mystica, the mystical union becoming one with God, is the idea that the human can traverse, transcend, and climb up beyond the realm of the material and out of the proverbial Platonic cave of shadows. In short, the unio mystica is the path of reunion and return to God. The last theme necessary for understanding how Neoplatonism resurfaced in disparate but similar forms in the rabbinic and Christian traditions is the method known as negative or apophatic theology. Via negativa in Latin is the path of negation, where, to quote Socrates, the thinker realizes that true wisdom proceeds from the knowledge that we know nothing. In order to come to know God or the oneness of being, one must proceed by a process of negations rather than affirmations about the nature of God. Since God exceeds our capacity to comprehend his full nature, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, it is not possible for us to know what God is, but what God is not.
Can I pop in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think, again, we have the difference between the Platonic Christian revealed tradition. It's there in the tradition, it's there in the scripture, it's revealed. Everybody, it's kind of democratic. Everybody can see what it is. The Gnostic, we'll call Gnostic, is kind of has the hidden, showing you that the adept with the gnosis can penetrate the mystery that is left in tension in the traditional account.
Thanks. While for Aquinas and Pseudo-Dionysius, negative theology was utilized as a method to humbly approach the incomprehensibility of God, who is the ultimate source of goodness, beauty, and truth. The rabbinic apophatic approach arrives at Ein Sof. Literally meaning without limit, Ein Sof, who unlike God the Father, is an explicitly negative and impersonal designation that not only transcends our notions of absolute truth, but obliterates them altogether. Elsewhere, the Kabbalists refer to Ein Sof simply as nothingness or emptiness, that negates the categories of being and nothingness, existence and non-existence. To say that it exists is already saying too much. The limitlessness of Ein Sof is translated to mean infinity without end, but also without duration. This concept of the infinitesimally minute moment of time breaking into the expanse of infinity, mirroring the Big Bang, will be key to the kabbalistic notion of the Messiah we will discuss later. It is important to trace these strains of influence deriving from Neoplatonic concepts in order to distinguish how these problems in ontology were resolved in the tradition of Catholic theology and adopted later by kabbalistic speculation on the nature of reality. The Prisca Theologia that emerged during the Renaissance, so this would include things like Christian Kabbalism, Hermetic Kabbalism, that Christian thinkers began to adopt, was an attempt to syncretize all religious systems via the transcendence of the one in the Neoplatonic ontology. This effort survives today in the perennialist school of traditionalism. The Unio Mystica and Great Chain of Being correspond generally to Catholic teachings on the sacramental economy, the mystical body of Christ, the communion of saints, and the hypostatic union. By partaking in the most blessed sacrament, we Catholics are absorbed into the mystical union with the divine through the medium of Christ's eternal sacrifice, resolving the problem of the one and the many. For rabbinic thinkers, as stated above, the source of God in the world has been shattered into innumerable shards of light that must be regathered in order to repair God to his oneness, a process known as Tikkun Elohim. God can only come to know himself through the collective effort of man. The famous Sephirot tree, also called Tree of Life, imagined by the tradition of Kabbalah, as a model for the paths by which God descended into reality, splintering into increasing disparity along the way. The path of the Zimzum, that is the constriction of the Godhead, zigzags between nodes known as the Sephirot, or spheres that are unfolded into binary distinctions. These distinctions are the subjects of endless speculation by generations of Kabbalists for generating models of the redeemed world to come. While the emanation from the one in Christian theological terms is radiated in one direction through the perfected forms of creation and the body reborn in Christ, the emanations of the Sephirot are multidirectional as quicksilver in the minds of rabbinic speculators. The theory of emanation is a counter strategy to unite the many into the oneness of the metaconsciousness, reverse engineering the great chain of being. How you doing there, Doug?
Good, good. I'm going to let you go on. What I sort of see sometimes people can write this all off and just say it's this false Abrahamic faith. And go for it, whatever. But I do see from the revealed tradition, this Gnostic tradition can't just exist in itself. It has to parasite. I'm just fascinated by that. Through the parasite, and this is the problem with Christian Zionism, this is where I'm going. Through the parasiting of this, they can turn Christianity that's yoked itself too much with this, a sort of diminished Christianity, a sort of Gnostic Christianity can become default part of the dialect because you have a sort of a set of false premises plus the opposite together working toward the same end. I probably said too much there. I think the more important part of what you're saying is that this Gnostic tradition, it works out a negation, but it also has to always parasite from the eternal forms.
Although the Rebbe employed the standard symbolic tropes of the personal Messiah established in rabbinic literature, according to Wolfson, this does not mean he upheld strict allegiance to a literal interpretation. Seen through the prism of the Hasidic tradition, there can be no material reality without heeding its symbolic correlate. There is no literal that is not metaphoric. Or as Schneerson said, there is no namish that is not mashal. What happens in materia corresponds in spiritu and vice versa. For the Rebbe, mundane matters could not be understood without its symbolic double. So likewise, the Messiah in fact is the same as the Messiah in form. According to this logic, the rhetoric of a personal Mashiach serves as a signpost to a state of unification in which all individuation, including the individuated sense of a Redeemer, passes into the formless essence of Ein Sof. Collective and personal redemption are unfolded in the dialectic where the limits of the one and the many hinge upon a relationship with a Redeemer obtained through self-nullification converging into nullified reality. This leap into meta-consciousness is preceded by shedding of personal boundaries into impersonhood, into the meta-ontological void. The true Messiah will be the one to reveal that there is no Messiah. For Schneerson, the image of the personal Messiah may have been utilized rhetorically to liberate one from the belief in the personal Messiah in favor of an impersonal or collective messianism. To quote Elliot Wolfson, the millenarian enthusiasm that fueled Schneerson's mission from its inception was about fostering the true expansion of knowledge into an epistemological shift parallel with a change in cosmological orientation. This millenarian enthusiasm toward an epistemological shift that radically reorients mass consciousness echoes the eccentric Jesuit paleontologist and mystic Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. To quote Douglas Haugen, Chardin in his work, The Phenomenon of Man, famously put forward the concept of a noonosphere, a spiritual version of the lithosphere or biosphere, the collective consciousness of all human beings as though it is a physical substance. Chardin posited that it was the destiny of this noosphere to evolve into a future humanity of egoless, immortal, electrical Christ energy. Individualism is just some passing phase in which we are to overcome in Jesus and be united with one another. The soul/mind is reinserted in great 20th century New Age tradition as mere energy, compatible with the growing awe before just so much electrical wiring. Christianity version 2.0 leads towards an immanentized eschaton of history, an omega point brought about by man's exteriorization of his nervous system through electronic networks. We are dealing with millenarian thought at its most bizarre. Or to quote Schneerson's Hasidic predecessor, the Baal Shem Tov, when the furthest extents of materialism become well springs of the innermost wisdom, then Moshiach will come. This is our mandate now. We are all to become well springs. You good there, Doug?
Yeah, I could say a few things. I'm going to let you go.
Okay, go ahead if you want to.
Yeah, I'm not going to bring in Martin Berber right now. Go ahead.
Okay. Hasidism, throughout its history, has been committed to divulging mystical secrets, the hidden Torah, spreading the well springs outward to instill the concept of divinity for proper worship. The coming of Moshiach must be prepared by the conversion of nature, culture, and material reality to become vessels for the mystical language of Kabbalah, to become vessels for the sparks of the divine. Just as God spoke creation into being, the insertion of man-made language and code into the natural order fulfills the assignment of the Moshiach. These well springs pour forth the hidden gnosis of the secret Torah, which envelops the mystical coalescence of opposites, transcending the law and enfolding holy and profane, the permissible and forbidden. The nullification of the natural order invites a leap of being into the holy other. Accelerating the contradictions opens the well springs.
Okay. Yeah, so the leap of being, that could be mass carnage. You know, the book of Revelation, people have kind of gone there with this tribulation as being the necessary fire to ignite a leap of being. I want to let you go a little bit, but the Apostle Paul, of all the great Jewish minds, this is great for Christian apologetics, but nobody wants to go and touch it. But among the greatest minds into the 20th century, the greatest interior critique of Judaism, historical Judaism, was from the Apostle Paul, whose interior critique had to do with the law and the devotion to the law. And even insiders will tell you inside this project, the problem with the law, the Apostle Paul would point out in the book of Romans and the book of Hebrews, and to some extent the book of Galatians, which is dedication to a law and the difficulty of keeping a law, the standard of the law in terms of universal righteousness, or to create a project that's truly universal outside the racial component. So what Christ did, he introduced personhood. And so the great heretics of Judaism have been like Sabbatai Zevi or the Hasids, because they introduced the personal, and that is an attack on the law. But yet they realize it's also the source of enthusiasm and a wellspring of hope. So most of the cutting edges of rabbinic thought in the 20th century were trying to go precisely after Paul's critique, realizing that they, in a sense, can't get around it. So they're hemmed in a sense, and they realize that. And at a cosmic level, I believe the reason this is because Paul was correct. And what we had before Paul is an age where God had built up the world to the idea of the eternal forms, and that we can have a relationship with the eternal forms. But what Christ introduced was the person. That what our deepest longing for is to have a connection, that the forms can get us to the Trinity, and the Trinity is a personal relationship with perfection in our own destiny. And it pulls and universalizes everything in this project together. So what you're getting at right now, and I'll let you go for it, is this distinction between, they realize that's the loose screw in the whole project, is they need the personalness of it. And the midway point of the Sabbateans into the Hasids has been the ability to build up the anticipation about the Antichrist that will finish the project with a personal element. So on one side of the mouth, the project says we don't need a personal savior, but the other side realizes that the project will never be complete without the personhood of a Mashiach. Am I with you a little bit here on this?
Yeah, that's you touched on a lot of things there. But yeah, the notion of impersonal salvation versus collective salvation is a major dialectic here that has to be overcome. And there's this sense that the law has passed away. The temple's been destroyed. There's no longer temple sacrifice. So there is this cult of personality that arises out of the rabbinic tradition, in which the chutzpah, the daring of the rabbi to innovate within the tradition of the law, is what energizes and renews the law. The law requires heresy, basically, as a strategy towards survival. So the Messiah always appears as a heretic, and that's how Jesus is categorized as sort of a holy heretic, like Shabtai Zvi. There's always this conflation. Well, Jesus was just they try to liken Jesus, who was crucified by his own people, was hated, spit upon, offered up in exchange for the thief Barnabas, and Shabtai Zvi was openly having orgies and bacchanals in the streets, promoting all types of sort of things I don't really want to go into, and he captured the faith of 50% of world Jewry. So I don't think there's a lot of correlation there between Jesus and Shabtai Zvi, but that's a common strategy in order to sort of diminish the stature of Jesus within this story of world redemption through a personal Messiah and a personal relationship with the divine.
Yeah, the project requires heresy. And for us with the egregore, in theology, heresy is also known as perversion. It's a perversion of the doctrines of perfect forms. And so that's how you develop the charisma and the ethereal energy to create these thought prisons and so forth. I'm going to let you keep going, Will.
Great. Yeah, that'll come up again. So hold that thought. According to Schneerson, the worship appropriate to the Messianic epoch is the worship of the aspect of what is called Yehidah, which means the unification of this dimension of the soul unique to the Jewish people, and by virtue of which the Jew can be united with the one true essence at the source of emanation. A nullification of existence, which is also described as the absorption in the oneness of Ein Sof of the infinite. So the aspect of Yehidah makes it possible for one who has achieved this annihilation of existence to be incorporated in the oneness of Ein Sof. Messianic consciousness is about overcoming the individuated sense of self. Note here, personal redemption requires a personal Mashiach. This was pronounced by Schneerson on the 8th day of Passover in the year 1987, and note during the feast, in keeping with Lurianic and Sabbatean traditions, the Chabad custom is to celebrate the exodus from Egypt with a third Seder meal that foreshadows the future banquet of the Messiah. According to Talmud and Zohar, at this meal, the smoked flesh of Leviathan, the holy serpent, will be served to all the righteous as a sign of the serpent's messianic potential. His skin will be tarped overhead as a sukkot tent that illuminates the feast, representing the messianic unity attained in Yehidah. At this feast, the righteous Jew is assimilated into the impersonal metaconsciousness of the Moshiach, the aspect of oneness that is unique to the Jewish soul and not the satanic spheres of the non-Jew, to quote Schneerson, achieves the nullification of the self, as well as the annihilation of existence, to be reincorporated into the oneness of Ein Sof. As Elliot Wolfson is fond of saying, only the Jew, as it were, has what it takes to become nothing. By unifying the Sephiroth and connecting the many to the one, the Kabbalist attempts to perform a great leap of being through self-nullification by negating the distinctions inherent in the present reality. Through absorption into the infinite negation, only the Jew has access to the divine. In keeping with the tradition of the Lurianic Kabbalah and Sabbatean Frankism, the contemporary Chabad movement holds that the redemption of the world depends solely on the nation of Israel. Chabad thinking presumes that the Jew is essentially different from other nations, insofar as the Jewish soul alone has the mark of the divine. To quote the late Rebbe Schneerson, the non-Jewish soul stems from the three demonic spheres, while the Jewish soul stems from holiness. There's a qualitative difference between the soul of the Jew and the soul of all other ethnicities. The latter possesses an animal soul, which derives from the aspect of the shell, also called the husk, dross, or klipot. From the demonic other side, the sitre okara, which is located in the left chamber of the heart, whereas the former is endowed with the divine soul, the spark that emanates from the light of the infinite, and is located in the brain as well as the right chamber of the heart. This thinking narrows the gap between creator and created in regard to the Jewish nation. The Kabbalists, in their mystical practice, saw themselves as partaking in the divine drama of creation, revelation, and redemption, becoming in their mystical union with the divine Hashem himself, in order to rectify God and to change his reality. Any thoughts there, Doug?
I had one a moment ago and it just fell out my head. I'm going to let you keep going.
All right.
Oh, let me say this.
Sure.
So just quickly. So the problem with the one and the many is resolved within the Catholic social order in part through the sacrifice of the Holy Mass. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. And I think the sacraments in general, but most specifically through the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist, which unites us into Christ's into his sacrifice, the one sacrifice of all time. So we are transcended with him through our partaking of that sacrifice in the form of the Eucharist.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. In contrast, however, in the mystical soteriology of Schneerson and the Kabbalists, this messianic leap of being employs double standards in order to resolve the problem of evil. From this perspective, in the redemption of Jews and non-Jews must take separate paths due to the origin of evil in the cosmos. According to Talmud and Zohar, the 10 kings of Edom, mentioned in Genesis 36, represent the stronghold of unholiness in the earthly and political realm. Edom, being associated with Esau, symbolizes that which is rejected by God, like the non-Jewish soul that originates in the satanic spheres, while the kings of Israel are descended from Jacob and stem from holiness. Likewise, all Gentile empires, especially those that exercise authority over the Jewish nation, are iterations of Edom, the kingdoms of evil that plague the earth. From this perspective, all Gentile civilization descends from Edom and must be blotted out by the Messiah at the dawning of the world to come. According to the medieval Kabbalists and their followers, Rome, Christianity, and most specifically the Roman Catholic Church, stands as the preeminent iteration of the Edomic power that must be subdued and destroyed by Israel. A common motif in rabbinic interpretations of the Old Testament identifies a pattern where the prophets first descend into Egypt before they are given revelation. As we have seen above with Job, this consistent theme foreshadows Jesus' escape to Egypt as an infant and his descent into hell for 3 days after his death. From the rabbinic perspective, Egypt is viewed as an ancient kingdom of Edom, typified by idolatry, sorcery, and oppression. Wolfson states, just as God had to discharge the impure forces in divine thought before God could emanate the holy forces, so too the human soul must refine himself and remove all dross before it can attain the level of holiness. This image of spiritual transformation drawn from alchemy is related by the Zohar to the verse, and Abram went down to Egypt from Genesis 12. The esoteric meaning of Abram's descent into Egypt, as that of the children of Israel in the time of Moses, is spiritual purification by means of contact with the demonic. Moses Cordovero, in his commentary on the section of the Zohar, says, as silver is refined in lead, so holiness is refined through the power of the demonic. Before partaking of holiness, entering into the Sephirotic realm, it is necessary to go down to the depths of the unholy. Evil here is not defined as that which violates the Mosaic law, but instead as that which apprehends the messianic promise of Israel's incorporation into the absolute divine. Insofar as Edom exists in a state that is not fully submitted to the dominion of Israel, the advent of the Messiah will be frustrated. Just so, in order to accelerate his coming, the assignment of the mystic is to submerge himself into the realm of evil, that is, into Gentile society, to extract and purify the spark of holiness to be reincorporated into the messianic project. Rendered exoterically, this means to convert Gentile cultural norms to adopt the mystical secrets of Kabbalah and accept rabbinic legal authority. How we doing, Doug?
I'm with you.
Okay.
I'm with you. I'm seeing it.
Okay, great. A goal found ubiquitously throughout the writings of the rabbinic period from the time of Maimonides, and especially prevalent in the contemporary messianic mission of Rabbi Schneerson, was the mandate to implement the Noahide laws upon Gentile society. On their face, these 7 commandments set explicitly for the non-Jews seem in keeping with the 10 commandments in traditional moral law. However, when their secret meaning is traced from the Talmud and other rabbinic commentaries, they appear clearly as a strategy for the annihilation and auto-demolition of the Christian West and the Catholic social order. In 1992, in honor of Rabbi Schneerson, U.S. Public Law 102-298 was passed by Congress under recommendation by President Bush, establishing the 7 Noahide laws as an honorary decree. Likewise, most industrialized nations have followed suit and honored or passed the Noahide laws in some form at the behest of the Lubavitchers and the Rebbe, demonstrating the inordinate political influence of this small sect that comprises only a small segment of world Jewry. Even though these laws outwardly condemn deviant sexual behavior and polytheism, member countries of the neoliberal order honor these edicts as unquestionable stand-ins for the moral law. According to Maimonides and many other Talmudic sages, violating these commandments is punishable by decapitation, shedding light on the prophecies of Revelation 20. The first Noahide laws forbids idolatry, which according to the rabbinic definition means worship of the Holy Trinity. When these laws will become enforced is not yet disclosed. Just as all distinctions must be transcended in the world to come, the problem of evil must be resolved by eliminating the satanic source of the non-Jewish soul. The Adam Kadmon is a kabbalistic concept that appears in the Zohar as the supreme primordial man who stands for the unification of the Sephiroth into the oneness of the divine. This archetype of complete and perfected humanity stands as the mystical model for collective Jewry, united within the tree of life by the Messiah who will lead them back to the Garden of Eden. The future redemption, in this view, is the reclamation of the past. The transmoral morality of the Kabbalah requires the purification of the non-Jew, rendering the unclean kosher. According to Wolfson, the rectification will be complete only in the future when there will be no more distinction between Jew and non-Jew, because the latter will be reincorporated into the post-human form that, like the pre-lapsarian Adam, is neither Edom nor Israel, insofar as there is no autonomous evil in opposition to the good. The post-human, for to which, according to this view, the non-Jew is destined, will no longer hold the autonomy to oppose the righteous. It would seem that since the existence of non-Jews hasn't been completely eliminated through genetic, chemical, and cultural engineering, they have been let me back up here. It would seem that since the existence of non-Jews hasn't been completely eliminated through genetic, chemical, and cultural engineering, they have been converted to the post-human form as a spiritual battery or data storage for the Jewish meta-consciousness. All right, Doug, I'm starting to wrap up here. You got any thoughts? I know it's pretty heavy black pill stuff there. So
some stories came out this week. I think we got Harari, Bill Gates, and one other person. Harari and another spokesperson at the WEF's talking about in the future you will have to become part of the battery. I think it was quite literal. And then information, I'm just about Bill Gates getting the patent on human beings becoming batteries. So I don't know, I can't help it. I don't know if those are actual connections, but being part of the battery. And before you kind of go on or conclude, so we're talking about going to the depths, going into evil to redeem the collective. So going into Edom, going into Rome, going into Christianity to redeem it. It seems to me that one of the center targets of this would be to go into the conservative Catholic rad trad movement. Most of the hardcore line of it would be the people that want to preserve the traditional Latin Mass out of one side of their mouth, but yet at the same time promoting neocon strategies and not really going into the intellectual roots of liberalism, which has always been incompatible with Catholicism, and the neoliberal, neoconservative project that necessarily requires the most conservative elements of the Catholic social order now being manifest in the preservation of the Mass. So if I have any point of this, I just notice that these people, it's kind of like the dialectic with CNN and Fox News. We'll call them Democrats, but we won't call them anything else. And that's something I just see in the rad-trad movement is, I'm sorry to say it this way, in that sense, they strike me as a limited hangout, a little bit clueless. If you're going to really preserve Catholicism, you have to understand who your enemies are. So this state of emergency of what Carl Schmitt would say, when you play with the ecclesiology of the church, that is, this is the one visible, holy, apostolic replacement and completion of the Old Testament. We recognize it through the sacrifice of the Mass. Once you kind of play around and get double-minded about this, you don't realize that who seemingly, there's a paradoxical, who seemingly are the preservers of Western Christianity are at the tip of the spear for attack and can be transmutated into this new form of otherness through the people that can be the only perfect otherness. So we got that in the barrel. On top of this, we got Russian Orthodoxy, which also we can get into later is going to be brewed into this big Israel or heavenly Jerusalem project that seems to be winding in the sort of alchemical brew of what looks like it will be post-Ukraine. I'll call it the Project Ukraine, the esoteric biopolitics of Ukraine. I think I maybe put too much out there. Did anything resonate in terms of rad trads and the Mass for you there?
Yeah, that's where I'm headed with my little conclusion here.
Oh, I didn't mean to put the
No, not at all. No, that was great to kind of set the stage for me. But yeah, this I mean, for all the effort to reveal the conspiracy within inside the church, be it the the Alta Vendita and the stonecutters, quote unquote, who are trying to infiltrate and adapt the church into this one world system. There's no, and as we've mentioned many times before, there seems to be no interest or no concern for the fact that the leaders of these organizations, and in their own words, are following Kabbalah. In Albert Pike's own words, the higher levels of the lodge are constructed around the ideas in the Zohar, and these ideas are about, like we've laid out here before, creating a Messiah and destroying Catholic society and eliminating what is sacred and replacing it with what's profane. So when we see things happening in the Vatican with like the World Jewish Congress and the B'nai B'rith, and we look at the Nostra Aetate document in Vatican II, we can kind of see this as the epicenter of this project of this messianic project of submerging itself into the quote unquote evil of Edom, which is Roman Catholicism, and trying to extract out of it this messianic project of consolidating world power around a messianic class of people. So yeah, there's that. The idea of replacement theology, I think, can be applied in a lot of different directions. Like I hope to get into this a little bit next time, and the double standards that are promoted as a kind of a form of worship, even. So, for instance, the notion of the Holocaust implies a sense of sacrifice and offering to God. And internally, the Jews refer to it as the Shoah, which means the cataclysm or the disaster. And but for reasons, the Gentile society, particularly Christianity, are constantly reminded to refer to it as the Holocaust, and any question of that is denial, and it's it's hate speech, it's a threat to peace everywhere. And Christ's sacrifice on Calvary was the ultimate sacrifice for all time. It ended the law. It unified the promise of the law into one eternal sacrifice for all time, and that's our messianic hope. That's how we are unified. The many are unified into the one. So when we tacitly consent to the notion of another sacrifice or a human sacrifice, which places greater import and value upon one class of people, when there were many different groups of people, Poles, Russian Orthodox Christians who were exterminated and genocided during the world, Second World War period. When we place this exclusionary or exclusive importance and value upon this one sacrifice, it's a form of replacing the replacement theology. We're substituting
a negation of the replacement theology, which is the replacement of Catholic ecclesiology.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. They're inducing Christians to tacitly deny the sacrifice of Christ as being the one true sacrifice of all time through this idea of there being, a secondary collective sacrifice.
Right.
I hope to clarify that a little bit more next time with this idea of, the worship of repentance that in which guilt is transformed into innocence, and how this relates to the revelation of the method, and how tacit consent is induced through predictive programming, social engineering, and how that anyway. Let me conclude here. I think this will maybe clarify a little bit more. Unless you have anything else you want to say there, Doug.
No, I mean, one way of phrasing a lot of this, and I think Chuck Baldwin's actually been onto this for quite a few years. In short, what's going on is they're trying to put Gentiles back under the law. And essentially, tacitly, the evangelicals, the rapture group, like I said, the pre and post millennials are conceding in part to that. But now when you get rad trads, that's the end of the show, right? Because that's the whole theology of Catholicism. It's about the millennial kingdom here, not the one to come. So it begins by pulling you down from the eternal forms and putting you into the ensof of the ruling elite's plans. So the final plan would be everybody to kind of reject that kingdom, reject the finished work. And I don't see many people that are willing to make that stand. I think they'd rather put a sword in them, become part of the cancel culture, before they stand up for Christ in that regard. But does that sound right to you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it nowhere is more explicit in Christianity than in the this burgeoning Hebrew roots movement that seems to be capturing most of the young people in Protestantism, and this Torah observance, and Saturday Sabbath, and those kind of things. We can hatch some of that out next time, I hope. And let me read this final passage here, and then I think you'll probably have some thoughts on that, and then we can go from there. So, okay. The presentation next time will focus on the mass psychic transformation necessary for the messianic world to come. As Schneerson said, the advent of the new age will be marked by the worship of repentance, meaning, in this sense, the transvaluation of guilt into innocence through the medium of tacit consent. To quote the early 20th century Zionist Maurice Samuel's book, You Gentiles, another aspect of the mechanics of disillusion makes clear a difficulty somewhat more subtle, but even more effective. The death of a people or of a type can be natural only. Race suicide as an ideal is a contradiction, for an ideal is a manifestation of life. Deliberately to set before ourselves the objective of self-elimination would be as absurd as a man insisting on watching himself fall asleep. It can be done tacitly only. It can happen, but it cannot be propagated. We might drift out of consciousness, but every effort to accelerate the pace would retard the process. So in summary, the effort to nullify a population often results in the opposite effect, where group identity is galvanized under the threat of its destruction. Just as the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, the coerced auto-demolition of the church loads the pendulum to swing in the opposite direction, reawakening traditionalists. As Vladimir Lenin stated, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves. Perpetual scandal and state of emergency in the church entices speculation and the regalvanized support of traditionalists trying to unravel the knot of corruption. The annihilation of a people, as Maurice Samuels maintains, requires tacit consent, lulled to sleep by the white noise of cognitive dissonance. The open secret begs the attempt to unmask the veil of secrecy that enfolds the seeker into greater deception.
Yeah. Yeah. So in Carl Schmitt's terms, this really began, I mean, because in our book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, which is kind of a play on Norman Cohen's, he was a mid-century English intellectual and historian that had the book In Pursuit of the Millennium, which is this ancient mass psychosis that happens when people, I guess, adopt the egregore, the mind prison of the millennium on Earth and participating in that millennium. At any point, I just wanted to say Carl Schmitt, and we really go into this with the rise of Puritanism, and that is Carl Schmitt's state of exception. And what happens with the state of exception is there's a realignment. Whoever comes up and tells you what to do and think and believe is the true sovereign, because you're in a state of doublethink and cognitive dissonance. And in that moment, when they have you hold two simultaneous things as true, traditional Catholicism and Zionism, which are radically opposed. So something that has always historically been understood now. So what happens then is the friend and foe distinction becomes, so between what the Bible describes as those that reject Christ as people you shouldn't yoke yourself, enemy. During the Puritan period, the Catholics and Muslims were the ultimate enemies, and the Zionists were the good guys, and they yoked themselves and adapted their project. They put themselves in that mindset. So what we have today is this, again, switching around of the friend-enemy distinction and getting out of the categories that were traditionally understood. And as far as this kind of inverse typology, the blood of the martyrs that made this whole thing happen, we don't even have people, in order to preserve what's left, people that are willing to even get out of their comfort zone and stand up historically for who are the friends of the church and who are the enemies. And if we truly want to preserve this, I'm sorry to be mean, I'm going to do it. Instead of concentrating on click counts and how big that frickin' Patreon must be over there, y'all. So I didn't want to end things that way. but so that's kind of the significance. The sovereign in this case, when everybody's double thinking and scared and just going to bow to authority, that's the sovereign that's going to redefine where we going and what's your place. And the role of the Noahide laws that might be in prophecy, beheaded people, but that is going to be a part. I think you're going to get there next time, of this violent necessity, according to the eschatology, to get the leap of faith. The massive, it's almost an inversion of the blood of the martyrs put on the Noahide laws. And you'll have to decide at that moment, if this happens in our lifetime, who is your friend, who is your enemy, what are you going to stand up for, your own personal comfort or your eternal security? Well, that's been great, Will. A lot of information to think about, and I think the best stuff is yet to come. So unless you have any last things to say, let's wrap this up.
I'm good over here, Doug. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure as always, and God bless our listeners out there. Thanks for tuning in.
Excellent. Okay. Again, I think if there's a theme that pulls together what Will and I have been talking about, the forces of this world want to take your imagination that should be set toward the eternal forms, the true, the beautiful, the good, and ultimately the Logos, Jesus Christ, the Savior of all humanity, and will be the Redeemer of all things. So, Will, thank you again for everybody out there. Thank you for joining us. This has been another episode of Dr. Deep State.